Yes, that was me back in 2005. I was traveling to the United States with the late dean of my university to inspect the EAP unit that was teaching students from our university. We had been sending our students to this university for a few years to study English on a semester abroad program. On this trip, we actually got more than we bargained for. We were invited by the president and senior administrators to accompany them to a swanky resort where the president was to receive, on behalf of the university, a state award for total quality assurance. Normally, this award was only given to major corporations in the area, and there were CEOs from other corporations at this event also to receive similar awards. But for both of us, the dean and I, we found that even though we could speak English, we couldn't understand the language that was going on here, because the language of the administrators was truly similar to that of CEOs, businessmen, or even sometimes security services, as one of the administrators was a former Secret Service agent of several American presidents. Of course, we spoke on the issue of EAP with them, and everyone seemed to have a view as to the purpose of EAP and international students for the university and how they could serve the purposes of the university in the 21st century. Most seemed either unaware or unconcerned that their plans for EAP would have major implications for the EAP teachers and students currently at the university, who were working in what some have observed to be more or less equivalent to an academic sweatshop. The contrast couldn't have been greater between what was going on here and what was going on in the EAP unit. And during this time as well, I also noticed the EAP director who had been invited going around, shaking hands, and basically doing the political groundwork needed to keep his unit alive. All of it was very disconcerting, especially since the dean and I had both noticed that similar versions of the discourse and values that we were seeing in this meeting were at that time just starting to creep into Japanese higher education, which at the time, in 2005, had more similarities to, let's say, the late 1960s of the United States and UK than it did in the early 21st century. What happened here was a pivotal moment for me, and it caused me to start asking the question, what's going on here? What's happening? What's happening to EAP, and what's happening to me? Because I began to feel the ground changing under me as well. Little did I know that this journey would take me through 3 countries, run over 6 years, allow me to visit and study 11 different universities, interview over 98, but there were at least several students and other groups beyond this, but at least 98 primary informants with interviews that lasted between 45 minutes to an hour, generating over 1,300 pages of transcripts, and then add to that a very large database of journals, photos, videos, field notes, things such as repertory grids, all of it coming together to create a critical grounded theory, which will be the topic of this 2-hour seminar. Drawing from Halliday's concept of the context of culture, during the first part of this seminar, I'll take you through the methodology of grounded theory and try to unpack some of the terminology in this form of research. And that'll be followed by a range of socio-political and economic factors that emerged from or stood behind my study of what informants were saying to me. Whenever possible, I'll show you snippets of data so that you'll know that the grounded theory that will be presented in the second part of this seminar was critically constructed, not just cynically made up from my own bias. After that, I hope that we'll have some time for some questions and answers. Okay, now let's look at the methodology. Grounded theory, typically called GT in the literature, was originated by Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss in the 1960s in the book The Discovery of Grounded Theory, Strategies for Qualitative Research. An interesting point is that for qualitative research, especially in the area of nursing science, business studies, organizational theory, educational studies, those who have dealt with sociological issues and theories about what seems to be going on in those areas, a bibliometric study that studied the papers published between 2000 and 2008 found that 66% of the papers that were in these areas, and again were engaged in qualitative research, used either a partial or a full form of the grounded theory methodology to conduct their studies. Now, I'm sure that some of you may want to know what I mean by grounded theory. Well, first, by grounded, I mean that it's situated in the actions, words, symbols of specific people, places, and things. It's a study that begins as empirical research. It strives to be open and reflexive. Certainly, researchers have biases, and in a grounded theory study, the researcher is open about his or her biases and limitations and tries to put those aside as he or she enters into the field to study a specific group of people in a specific area of study. Theory, in this sense, means that it is developed from the empirical study, that there are explanations developed of what seems to be going on, strategies, processes, and the idea is to give readers of that theory a measure of prediction or control or heightened understanding or insight into what is going on in a specific area. For example, a specific area of applied linguistics, or an area within certain organizations, or a certain group of people in a hospital study area. These are the types of things that grounded theory tends to study. Now, since we are in applied linguistics and EAP, there's a lot of people that would say, well, what's theory good for anyway? I apply things. Theory is all about that airy-fairy sort of thing. And so there's a lot of skepticism in applied linguistics about theory generation, since we're not typically a theory-generating field. We tend to apply the theories generated outward or outside our field. But I think that applied linguists and practitioners in EAP should be in the business of generating theory for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that EAP teachers, TESOL teachers, applied linguists, are often multilingual and have lived in a number of different countries and are multicultural, and they have access to people, places, things, and ideas that sociologists and academics from other fields could only dream about having access to. And I think that we have things to say and we have a contribution to make to other fields. But of course, on a more practical level, what's theory good for anyway? To that, I would say that basically theory helps to summarize what we know. It structures and guides our research, identifies the potential for action, and I think that it also opens up the way for communication across disciplines and among colleagues. I think that especially in this last part, once we start engaging in theory generation, we'll realize the connections that we have with people in other fields that we weren't aware of before. And I think that that's an empowering thing. Some more things I'd like to say about grounded theory is that when people refer to the term grounded theory in the literature, sometimes they mean the methodology. Sometimes they refer to grounded theory as a product, that is, a grounded theory, or they may also refer to grounded theory as a process. This is a confusing aspect of grounded theory, and many people have taken Glaser and Strauss to task for their confusing terminology. It is a problem. Whenever possible, I and others refer now to the methodology as GTM, the grounded theory methodology, and then to what has been produced by the methodology as grounded theory. But the idea of process, that is, of grounded theorizing, is also very popular among constructivist and postmodern grounded theorists. And I do think that this is a very helpful idea because grounded theory is exploratory. That is, it is not grounded fact. It is a process of discovery, and the grounded theory will have edges that will need to be tested, to be validated. There will be parts that need to be modified as new information comes in. And so seeing grounded theory as a process, that is, grounded theorizing, I think is a very helpful concept. Another thing that I need to point out is that grounded theory uses primarily qualitative research, but there are a lot of people who use quantitative research methodologies as well. Glaser and Strauss welcomed this and encouraged this. So from the very beginning, grounded theory started out as a mixed methods approach, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Another thing that I think is very important to know about grounded theory is that it is a disciplined approach to the field, to primarily qualitative data. Anyone who has become involved in some form of qualitative research that involves interviews or other such data can become quickly overwhelmed by that data and not know what to do with it. But grounded theory has a step-by-step and very helpful approach to keep people from becoming overwhelmed and drowned within the data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well later on. Finally, grounded theory does focus upon creating theories that are pragmatic and explanatory. If the theory doesn't help you in some way, if it doesn't provide, for example, a new vocabulary or a new way of seeing, if it doesn't help in some way, then the theory is just not very good. So putting it in another way, if we look at traditional research in TESOL and applied linguistics, typically it begins with a theory, doing the readings, following a research method, and then developing validated findings. Grounded theory takes a completely different approach. It starts from the ground up, as I said before, with something called open sampling, where you'll speak with all sorts of people in the field. You'll do exploratory interviews, observations, and constantly taking memos, that is, ideas of what may be popping up in your head about what you're seeing. I also use something called repertory grids, which is a quantitative form of research, and it bridges the gap between quantitative and qualitative research. If you're interested in knowing more about repertory grids, I can tell you something about that later on during the question and answer session. But then during this time of open exploration, you begin to become more focused by looking at specific people and specific places that seem to have much more to do with what people are talking about. That's theoretical sampling. Your interviews become more in-depth. You begin to involve yourself in something that's called substantive coding, which I'll explain later on, more and more memos. Then things will become, after some time, moving further up towards theory generation, where you will involve yourself in something called theoretical coding, having follow-up interviews, start looking at things called social processes, and then within that you'll go back into the field and constantly compare things that people are saying, like to like, and things that will try to break your theory. For example, if you get an idea about what you think is going on, you go out into the field again and actively look for the exceptions to the rules that you're developing. And using not induction but abduction, meaning that you'll begin to make theories about what you know is possible about going on. And at this time you begin to access the scholarly literature that seems to be related to what's happening in the field. You begin to move through this focused investigation back up to theory generation, and over time you develop a grounded theory. What does grounded theory bring to research, and what are the main aspects of it? I think that grounded theory has these four key components. One is that the coding of data is systematic, starting from open to middle level of substantive, and then to theoretical coding. The notion of constant comparison, I think, is also important, that people are constantly looking for the exceptions as well as the similarities. The researcher is open to himself, herself, and also open to the informants, to listening to what they say, but is also constantly challenging himself, herself, and the informants to find out the biases and the limitations. Grounded theory also involves what Silverman has called reconstructed logic, taking that vast mass of what's going on in the field, breaking it up and organizing it in a way that's understandable. Now, different from other forms of qualitative research, what grounded theory is primarily interested in are social processes, the things that people do, the actions, the solutions, the workarounds, those things that people do in the day. In this way, it's similar to activity theory, although the processes are not simply described, theories are developed about them and the processes are connected in interesting nets and networks and frameworks, which is something we can look at later on. I think a few words needs to be said about coding, because oftentimes when one speaks of this, one gets the idea of a computer coder or something scientific going on. I think the way one can understand coding might be helpful if you look at this example. Pretend, for example, that you have seen or that you're looking at an ancient manuscript. Typically, on the sides of the manuscript, one will find various words or summaries of sections written in the margins. Or as another example, if you've ever purchased a second-hand book, you may have opened it up and found that someone has taken copious notes by simply writing around on it and maybe blocking off sections or writing things on the side which essentially summarize what they think is going on in the text. Coding is more or less the same way in grounded theory. It derives from what Barney Glaser learned in Paris, called explication de texte, in which one looks at the text and summarizes blocks of it for greater comprehensibility. Here's an example of what I mean by coding. This is a section of an interview that I had with an informant, and you can see on the side where I have blocked off sections and have put, usually in gerund form, some small summary of what seems to be going on. Later on, as you might see here, I would connect certain codes to others. I would write memos about what seems to be going on and continue on in that process. All of this is the grounded theory of really looking at the data, describing what seems to be going on in a short, pithy sort of way, but also writing memos, which are essentially grounded hypotheses about what you think might be going on. You look at that later on, and over time, you develop a grounded theory. Looking at coding again, it starts out again at the bottom with open coding, where it's simply descriptive, short summaries describing of what's going on. Substantive coding involves making a summary of several open codes. You gather several of these open codes together, and you think, well, what do these have in common? And that descriptive label would become substantive coding. Over time, after you've developed a number of substantive codes, you may develop an even higher level of theoretical codes explaining how these substantive codes interact with each other. Then finally, this brings you up to the point where you have what's called a grounded theory. Looking at it this way, you start out with raw data, which then is turned into various forms of codes. The theoretical codes could be also called categories. Then you raise that up even more into some things called social processes. These are the things that people do on a very large, on a very general level. Oftentimes within grounded theory, as the methodology, you'll find a core index, something that will tie all of this together. And then reporting all of this that's going on is part of the grounded theory methodology and the product, as well as the process, of grounded theorizing. Now, when you publish a grounded theory or present it, this is basically what the readers can see. You often will get some of the codes, some of the categories, some of the, and well, definitely the social processes, and then the theory is presented in this way. Usually, if one has been in the field for as long as I have, say 6 years, it's impossible to produce all of the raw data, and all we can do is to present bits and pieces to let readers get an idea of what was going on in the field. But again, it's a theory about what's going on. It's the codes, the categories, the processes that are important for grounded theorists. Now, in my study, I did use something, as I said earlier, called a personal construct repertory grid. I use these because this type of methodology is one that allows the informants to have an interview with themselves. The data is analyzed statistically, but it also produces what are called constructs and elements, and these are words and values and worldviews that are generated by the informant. And that helps me to get around my own bias by having them provide me with the words and the perspectives on how they're seeing things. And those would become the basis for my interviews. As I said, my interviews were usually in depth, an average of 45 minutes. Some were as long as 90 minutes to 2 hours. And these would be followed up by field observations, because certainly people are limited in what they can say and limited in what they can see. And it's also important to, after studying what people have said, to go out in the field and see if there are any contradictions or any similarities to what they're saying. On top of that, I was able to, in time, access a huge professional literature archive that fit primarily with the types of people that I started to study, which I'll talk about later on in this seminar. This archive also contained much of the language and the perspectives and the values that fit with people that were in a certain area of EAP. A lot of the data that I had was also analyzed through software. One of them was Atlas TI, which is similar also to In Vivo. And what that is essentially a suite that holds all of the qualitative data, and you're able to link it up and to create theoretical linkages. It doesn't really make the theory for you. It's more or less an electronic version of the kitchen table, in which one lays out certain ideas and connects and disconnects and writes and thinks in a theoretical sort of manner. The personal construct repertory grids were analyzed using a program out of the University of Calgary called REP 4 1.12. So the process went something like this. Started out with a group of informants who went through a process of repertory grids, interviews, field observations, and of course lots and lots of notes, memos, and transcriptions. I spent a considerable amount of time theorizing about what they said, and then this led me to studying other forms of interdisciplinary research, current theories, coding, specialist literature, and not only did I do the coding in the computer, I also, as you can see in this picture, took time to cut codes up and to work on it literally on the kitchen table as well. That's a very helpful thing to do. And this led to more theorizing, and I go back to the earlier informants, new informants, and also access other research studies that seemed to be studying the similar areas that I was studying, and all of this eventually was this grounded theory methodology ended up in a product of the provisional grounded theory. Now, I think a few things need to be said about other forms of qualitative research, because especially in the literature of TESOL, EAP, and applied linguistics, not only are these forms of qualitative forms of research methodologies more popular, sometimes people will confuse these for grounded theory. I think that the main focus, for example, of phenomenology, and this is again American phenomenology, not European phenomenology, is that they seek to take people, take readers into the life world, the emotional life world of the informants. The phenomenologist enters into that world and then comes back out to try to relate that world to the readers. A good phenomenology study is one in which after you've read it, you feel as if you've lived in the skin, you've lived in the emotions and in the minds of the people. Ethnography typically focuses upon thick description. That's a term that was made in the 70s about what would be the best definition of ethnography. And thick description means that after reading an ethnographic report, you feel like you've been there, you've seen it. Action research typically focuses upon problems and solutions. And I think the case study research focuses upon what I would call eclectic specificity. It means that they look at specific cases and they use all forms of methodologies to find out what's happening in that specific area. And it's up to readers to generalize for themselves if the aspects from that case study to their own lives and their own practice. The arrows in the middle suggest that what has been happening for many years in qualitative research has been a mixing of these methodologies. You will find phenomenological case studies. In fact, a book that I wrote some years ago would be defined as that. You can find ethnographic action research. You can find ethnographic case studies. And they also mix the different methodologies as well, and for that reason, you will find ethnographies, for example, today that will use coding of data, which is something quite new relatively new for ethnographers. You'll find phenomenologists who will be talking about social processes. You can find action researchers who will talk about developing a theory or a process from their studies. What I'm trying to say is that some of the things that had started in grounded theory or had been really highlighted by grounded theory, aspects of the methodology have been adopted in these different qualitative research methodologies. But again, grounded theory's focus is upon social processes, and these other qualitative research methodologies, they're just fine. I mean, they're excellent for what they do. Their focus is upon lifting different aspects out of the qualitative world. And I think that we need to understand that and to see that if one is not interested specifically in studying the processes that are going on, and sort of divorcing the people and the places eventually and focusing only upon the different processes that are going on, one may not be interested in grounded theory as a methodology and might want to move on to something else, but should then be careful not to call that grounded theory in their publications. Now, there are lots and lots of different types of grounded theory methodologies, and I'm not going to get into that too much because that would take a long time. But I will say that the form of grounded theory that I use and which I've developed is called critical grounded theory. What makes critical grounded theory different from the rest is, first of all, it is based upon earlier forms, inspired in many ways in terms of methodology by Glaser and Kathy Charmaz, who has a form of grounded theory known as constructivist grounded theory. As well, Leonard Schatzman, a lesser-known grounded theorist, also has had many ideas that have gone into the creation of my methodology. In terms of the product of grounded theory, critical grounded theory, it's not afraid to critique instances of perceived injustice, inequity, and or social regression if they appear in the data. To give you an example of what I mean, if we were to use a Glaserian form of grounded theory and we were to go back in time to, say, 1943 and were to study Adolf Eichmann's Department of Transportation in Nazi Germany, The social processes that might develop from the interviews with the people in the office might be something such as keeping the trains running on time, negotiating with other departments, understanding memos, controlling information, and things such as this. And the theory would be truthful in many ways of what was going on there, but again, there would be one would totally miss the fact that this office was involved in carting millions of Jews off to their death in concentration camps. And I think that one of the weaknesses of the Glazerian approach is by simply focusing upon what people do, they can unwittingly support and solidify the status quo. Now, certainly, a number of grounded theorists would disagree with my viewpoint, and Sharmas, in fact, has started to come around in the past few years to support grounded theories related to issues such as of justice and social equality. But my critical grounded theory approach doesn't back away from those issues. I also do something that Glazer and Sharmas tend not to do, and that's to locate the grounded theories within their social and historical context. Sometimes grounded theories or earlier forms of earlier products of the methodology will discuss social processes, but people do not really know where from what sort of context, from what sort of area did these theories really develop, because I think that's very helpful in understanding how applicable these things may be to people in different areas. In terms of contextual factors, there are a lot of issues that arose from my interviews, issues that stood behind and sometimes influenced the nature of how people shaped the way they thought about issues in higher education. Some of these were globalization, massification, corporatization, culture wars, McDonaldization. I'm going to run you through these to give you an idea about what went into the creation of the grounded theory in the second part of this seminar. So go ahead and fasten your seatbelts, because here we go. Globalization, of course, is too big of a notion to deal with in just a few minutes. There are entire books written on the subject. What emerged from the discussions with my informants, though, seems to point to something that a lot of people in EAP are not really aware of, and that's the role that the end of the Cold War had upon English for academic purposes, TESOL, applied linguistics. Before the Cold War ended, higher education had been pretty much on the intellectual front of the Cold War. Governments both in the Soviet bloc and in the Western bloc put huge amounts of money into higher education and, of course, into the study of languages to especially highlight the cultural ideals of the country by unifying people around ideals of the nation, of the culture, of the language. This would keep people in some ways impervious to influence from the other side. Now, a lot of educational systems during this time in the smaller countries stayed on the fence by developing systems which are socialist in nature. That is, if the primarily capitalist United States and Great Britain won, they could shift to that side. If the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc were to win the day in the Cold War, then they could easily shift over to a more communist-style system. After the Cold War had ended, though, centrist policymakers didn't need higher education and EAP to uphold cultural ideals, because these ideals would be separating people from each other. Instead, they wanted people to be unified for global commerce. So that sort of comes into the codified into this statement. Looks rather Orwellian, I'm sorry. What came out of a lot of my interviews, depending upon who they were, was the issue of deconstructing cultures and building global markets. For example, look at this interview excerpt from a person who is who was the head of an EAP unit in a corporatized university. He said, "I've observed and found that there are various types of teachers and their approaches, and how they approach language acquisition by non-native speakers, and very often those people are not merely teaching English as a communication device, but are also teaching culture as part of that. Some are missionaries. They're there to take English and a heightened nature of culture to the primitives. It makes the teachers a little uncomfortable to hear so much native language speaking. So we have lots of strict rules about conduct and behavior, and coming late to class is a very, very bad thing. No matter what they do and however creative it is, that's still something that they're trying to do, is they're trying to get students to be taking on a culture, rather than having honest conversations about how they can navigate cultural difference. How can I give you a skill that you need, while maintaining your own cultural identity and giving value to that experience? ESL teachers should be able to take people that have a skill set that is required to be in this institution. You've got students that are coming here for multiple reasons. If you look at international student movement, about why they leave their home countries and to another place, then they're looking for technical capability of gaining new knowledge, and it's usually rare the student that comes to go somewhere and study art. So you can see in this typical example of an interview of issues denigrating and deconstructing culture and highlighting skills, technical skills, and knowledge that would be marketable for later on. Contrast this to another typical excerpt from an EAP teacher who had this to say. I often get tired of a thankless administration that does not seem to have a clue about what I do, to the extent that they apparently think I must twiddle my thumbs at least half of every day. So why do I keep on? I do it because I am still committed to the idea that language embodies the culture and highest ideals of a people, and that those ideals cannot be communicated between cultures without personal lives coming into contact in positive ways, both in and out of the classroom. I do it because, whether my students are rich or poor, they have personal goals and aspirations that I can help them achieve in some small way. I do it because it still excites me to see the light bulb come on and learning take place. In short, I do it for no really good reason at all, except to see somebody get some good out of something I can hopefully give them. After I retire someday, I hope to continue to do the same thing, but certainly fewer hours, but to do it for people who have no means to pay. One can see in this a stance against the growth of commercialism, of commerce, of the market, of neoliberal values seeping in and defining the nature of what one should be doing in higher education, and of highlighting issues of culture. And these are diametrically opposed viewpoints, and they're often manifested within this issue of globalization, the change of the Cold War, and people still holding on to Cold War values during an era now that focuses upon neoliberal values. Massification is another issue that comes into play when trying to understand the grounded theory that's to be presented later on in this thesis. For those of you who don't know what this term means, massification was a strategy started by U.S. policymakers after the Second World War, in which they encouraged large numbers of people to enter into higher education, primarily in the beginning through the GI Bill, later through easy to acquire student loans and grants. The notion behind massification is to get people out of unemployment and into higher education. It lowers the rate of unemployment in the country, and it allows people to be in a situation where hopefully they'll get new ideas and a higher level of education, by which they can then enter into the job market, improve the economy, and to develop innovative ideas for the society. Later on, other countries began to use a similar policy, although of course there were differences. In the UK and in Japan, there has been a movement to still maintain quotas on universities that exist, but to allow the creation of new universities, or to turn polytechnics into universities, which is why we have, of course, the post-1992 universities now in the UK. Japan's situation is a little more stark and reveals the bubble economy nature of of massification today, in that they have allowed 783 universities to be created in the country, and that's for a shrinking number of college-aged students. Related to this, because this bubble economy nature also affects higher education in other countries. In America, one informant said this. He said, "You've got 1,500 new freshmen and the prospect of getting 1,500 more and growing more just in what we're doing with the domestic side of things, or 20% the next 5 years. When we start tapping out all the area students and no one starts coming here anymore, that's when international recruitment always gets strong at any school. Make no mistake, even public institutions are running out of money in the States. Money and profitability are ongoing things here. That's the overriding trend here." Massification and globalization has led to what is called the corporatization of higher education, and of course, those who are in corporatizing universities now know very much what this is about. It's a move from education as a process and education as a contribution to society, and more that of a personal investment and of getting training to get a job, investing into a university education in order to get a job. And all sorts of things have gone into corporatization, as you can see from these slides here. Everything is now measured and is now geared towards gaining money, making money, spending money, and making money. And the role of teachers has moved, well, perceptibly from that of being one who educates and nurtures students to a service provider who is measured by their ability to satisfy students and to, well, meet certain processes and standards that have been set now upon them by administrative managers. At any rate, this is one issue that doesn't need a whole lot of explanation for those who are in such universities now, but it is one of the factors that constantly came up in the interviews with informants. Well, globalization and massification and corporatization are very, very important factors for the development of this grounded theory. But corporatization is not uniform in universities. There are different types of universities, and I need to point that out. What you're seeing here is based upon Twitchell's taxonomy of higher educational institutions, or HEIs, and that was drawn from the National Center for Post-Secondary Improvement at Stanford University. But the labels are my own. Typically within universities at the present, you'll see this axis of dynamics, one between communitarian ideas of highlighting aspects of the culture, of making a contribution to society, and some of the old values that are often expressed in university education, the liberal arts education before the Cold War, as juxtaposed to vocational training, higher education as making a contribution to the economy and to the society by giving people good and practical jobs. As well, within that, there's a neoliberal emphasis based upon Chicago School philosophy, focus upon the individual, focus upon the market, and focus upon those values because they tend to, in their belief, bring society to a better place, as opposed to the Keynesian emphasis where there's more community-based and government-based support for higher education and for the values therein. Within these dynamics, you'll see different types of universities. One of them is what I would call ivory towers, and those, of course, are the top-tier elite universities that have been maintained in some ways like educational heritage sites. Many of the elite members of society come through these institutions, and they have a vested interest in maintaining the status and the beauty and the value of those institutions because it relates to their status in society as well. But these are very rare, and oftentimes there are aspects of these universities which are all unattainable for other universities. They still stand for many people as a type of ideal. There are others that I call dream weavers, who are these universities are also very, very famous. Oftentimes people don't know exactly what they're famous for, but their names are well known. And so they have a branded image that they can sell and market. While they often have traditions and an image that fits with the communitarian ideals, they often have at their core a managerial cast that has a strong neoliberal emphasis to keep the institution afloat. There's also what I would call mass providers. Not only I, but Twitchell would also call this type of university a mass provider. And these are like the red bricks in the UK, or the prefectural or national universities in Japan, the state universities in the United States, a number of them. And these universities typically educate as much as between 70 and 80% of the students seeking a higher education in their respective countries. And as the name suggests, they are geared towards bringing in as many students as possible and graduating and or processing as many students as possible. They're also what I would call sausage maker institutions, and although that may seem a little bit harsh, they are clearly set towards training for vocations and with a neoliberal emphasis. They're often set with curricula that are very, very effective, though, because they know where their students are headed and they know the purposes for why they are there. And while these can be higher level vocational schools or further education schools, there are universities that do fit within this mold as well. One thing I've noticed is that there can be a slide in the status of a university. An ivory tower could become a dream weaver eventually. Dream weavers do and can slide towards mass provision, and mass providers do slide often over time towards that of being a sausage maker. And I think this is related to the pull of vocational training and neoliberal emphases right now in societies around the world. The study that I designed and the grounded theory that I developed focused primarily upon mass providers. Those were the majority of the universities that I accessed for this study. And that needs to be kept in the back of everyone's minds, because the grounded theory is focused more upon mass providers rather than ivory towers, dream weavers, or even sausage makers. There again, I should say that there are some blurred borders between each of these, but nevertheless, I focused mainly upon mass providers. I want to say again that corporatization is not only not uniform in the universities, it's not uniform within the different statuses as well. I've tried to show that with this graph. If you would see corporatization in its strongest form as being in the darker colors, and the communitarian and say pre-Cold or Cold War values as being the lighter colors, you will find that there will be aspects of corporatization within the ivory towers, the mass providers, the dream weavers, and sausage makers. Dreamweaver universities can also have certain departments that are more corporatized than others. And usually one can look at an EAP unit at a university to find out the level of corporatization within at least the managerial parts of the specific university. Something I'll come back to again later is that EAP units are worth study by not only people in education, but also in other sociological studies that are looking at higher education, because EAP units serve as a very interesting barometer for the level to which the administrative management of a university would like to have a standard or similar standard for the rest of the people in their universities. Something I suppose I can't resist when I'm speaking at Oxford is to toss in Tolkien. But these dynamics that I've discussed so far do tend to highlight culture wars. And in the interviews that I had with EAP teachers, the way that they viewed the ivory towers and dream weavers, sausage makers, mass providers often had an interesting connection with what you could find in the Tolkien mythology. They often viewed the situations within the ivory towers as something as visiting Rivendell, where it would be a wondrous and protected place. And the way they described it, of people going into these places, and with the mystery and the wonder, they would be able to go in and teach really good students, and they would have the freedoms and the values that they had once had long ago, but now they've been taken away. And so there was very much of an idealized view of the ivory towers, and most of the people that I had interviewed had never been to an ivory tower university, but still, the ivory tower university stood in their mind as the ideal that they wished that they could have had in their own working situation. For those who were in lower level dreamweavers and in mass provision, they often described, their discourse in their interviews often described their lives as something like the siege of Gondor, where they saw their universities as protected places, but that they were constantly under siege by the powers of corporatization. I suppose this is the vice chancellor riding into town. And they had mournful discourse, so that while some were still in protected places, they would look out over and see that the forces of corporatization, like orcs, were standing around and were preparing all sorts of plans and seeking to destroy what they had. And depending on the institution that I was at, there were some areas of the institution which were more corporatized than others. But progressively, over time, bit by bit, piece by piece, they felt that their lives and their teaching situations were being brought into disarray, and there was a great bitterness and a sadness that was often manifested in their discussions and interviews with me. Those who were in lower level mass providers, or those who had moved closer to that of being a sausage maker, described their situation in even starker terms. They saw a managerial elite that seemed to be taking their instructions from policymakers in unknown places, in dark and unknown places, that sought to develop an ironclad regime that was constantly being changed and regimented, and also it tended to be viewed and measured and constantly under surveillance from afar. And the way they described their lives as EAP teachers was that of having the Tower of Isengard being ripped asunder, and all of the good things that they once had suddenly been gutted, and they had become put on a type of factory type of situation where they were developing curricula and students into people who would serve the industrial or the corporate elite of their country. And for the teachers that I spoke with in these situations, there was even more bitterness and even more sadness, because they felt that they were the ones who were at odds with the entire university, that they were caught in between management and students, and that they themselves had become slaves or cogs in a terrible machine. Now, of course, one can look at this from the perspective from the new managers of higher education. And when I had interviews with them, they had a very different perspective, where they looked at people in the ivory towers as being arrogant, abstracted, and cold, and unwilling to engage in the real needs of society. They saw many of the teachers and workers and students in the mass providers and middle-level Dreamweaver schools as being untrustworthy, in it for themselves, self-serving, and again, not having the best the best interests of society and of industry in their minds and hearts as they did their jobs. And for those who were in the lower level universities that I interviewed, well, they felt that teachers and students, that they needed management, otherwise things would just not go in the right direction. I want to throw in another aspect that which will fit in with the grounded theory of this seminar, and that's from a lady by the name of Celia Whitchurch, who is at the Institute of Education in London. She brought out the concept of what's called third spaces, and she's been studying some of the same issues that I've been studying. And third spaces for her are the emergence now within many universities, primarily those committed to mass provision, that are controlled by and created by administrative management. And these are, for example, centers for excellence, or centers for service learning, centers for all various quasi-educational projects. These are the types of educational initiatives that administrative management would like the traditional academics to have to do, but they won't, or they often resist that. And so in these third spaces, they create new curricula that students can participate within, and they operate these third space institutions and spaces, let's just say, alongside the traditional curriculum. And I'll come back to this in a moment. But all of this does seem to come to play and become very much codified within the EAP unit. EAP units have become third spaces at most universities in the world, and the issues related to corporatization and, of course, massification and the means by which things are set in a very stratified and shall we say, mechanized way are found in the EAP units, and teachers and students alike often feel as if they're being ground into something that they weren't before. The process by which this goes through, of course, is what's been called in the literature McDonaldization. Those of you who don't know what this term means, it is connected to globalization in many ways. It's the means by which corporations often set things, make certain processes and plans uniform throughout the organization. No matter where you go, it's the same process, it's the same product, and it's intended to treat everyone equally. Now, within higher education, McDonaldization often emerges as into what I call automated pedagogical machines, or APMs. And what this entails is the creation of curricula and or systems by which you can cut teachers out of the process as much as possible and have students teaching themselves, or to have the process maintained in a certain way so that it's completely predictable and, shall we say, mechanized. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is an interview that I had with the president of a university, and he described EAP and education in these terms. Acceleration of learning is another. Optimizing the process. The simplest way to accelerate learning, the biggest payback, is to figure out ways to strip out the time that people spend listening to something they already know. Right. But once you focus on that, is working with this group of students, is to try to get them up to where the others are, then the others are just hearing stuff they know. Is there some way to optimize their time so that they're not wasting time on things they already know? So these things could be plugged into language teaching curriculum then. Yeah. The Taguchi model, a Japanese guy, what I learned from him on design is that you always try to design the system around the variables you can't control. You have no control over the entry-level skills that the students bring into your class. That's a function of what they learned in the past and maybe even their genetic makeup, etc. A whole bunch of variables, but what you get is what you've got. Here they are. Now, what can you do to design your course to be indifferent as possible to those entry-level skills? And his model, and this was an engineering model, his great success story, occurred in the United States, not in Japan. It was a plain paper copier where he said, okay, you have an operating window here, and then you have two extremes. One extreme is the copier jams, and the other one is that multiple pages go through. And we designed this to be indifferent to the paper that we put in as much as possible. Before, you had to have special paper. Remember that stuff that smelled and all that? Yeah, it was the mimeograph machine. Right. And he worked to design a machine. The Xerox machine was the first plain paper copier where you could stick almost anything in it. So I brought that concept back after I had had a meeting with him. I was a speaker at a banquet, and he was the instructor for the International Association of Engineers on Design. And I just called a group of faculty together, and I said, here's a concept, apply it. So this type of concept does end up resulting in a very mechanized form of education. It starts out first with curricula that are designed to strip out as much as possible the differences and to bring people through to create a uniform product. But what we've seen in some universities is the idea to get students completely into the curricula via online courses where the teachers are taken out. The system has been made to be as uniform as possible and to reach as many students as possible. In EAP, in some parts of East Asia, it's become even more interesting, as in this example in Korea, where there's been a strong, South Korea, where there's been a strong move to try to replace teachers with robots. Now, this is probably globalization and corporatization gone amok, and this really isn't a robot, because what this is a machine that's connected via the internet, and it's operated by a teacher in a call center in the Philippines, and the teacher can see the students through a video camera in it and control the robot. Interestingly enough, they have an avatar face of a blonde-haired Western woman. But this is a way to get, as the administrators who have set up these projects in small villages, is a way to get students in villages who are afraid of foreigners access to English, but also can strip out some of the issues that they have to deal with having foreigners in the village, having them to not speak the language very well, having to pay them a higher salary, and all the other issues that they really don't want to deal with. Again, I think this model won't work because instead of a teacher-fronted class, we have a robot-fronted class. But Japan's model for creating automated pedagogic machines is, instead of this, is to have computer-assisted language learning centers where students can, very similar to the way one would access a vending machine in Japan, would be able to go in and to get the bits of English that they want quickly, and have it repeated as much as possible in a uniform manner via a computer program, and then leave the call center, the computer-assisted language learning center, and go on their way. Celia Whitchurch, returning to what she said, also had another concept that has been very helpful for the development of this theory, and that's the concept of blended professionals. She said that within these third spaces, there has been the creation of these types of new workers, which who are neither teacher, neither are they academic. They're usually short-term or on yearly contracts, and they do administrative work. They also teach as well, and they teach in these special types of programs, and they teach service learning, or they teach remedial learning, or they teach EAP, and their role in the university is also somewhat, at this point, peripheral because they just don't have a clear identity as to who they are and where they fit in the university. Right, okay, getting closer to where we're going to go for the next part of the seminar. I often see EAP as in this type of dynamic where you have, at least in the corporatizing universities where this process of corporatization is ongoing, where you have an upper-level management, which I would call command and control, this massified international student demand, and see these as two swirling vortexes, one going down with its plans and its ideas and its initiatives, and the other with the international students swirling up with their agendas and their needs, and hitting in this point the center of praxis is where EAP is located with all of the struggles and dynamics and challenges that take place there. Within this center of praxis, there emerges a new type of worker that is the study of my grounded theory, and they're called blended EAP professionals, or bleeps. The humor that you may feel around that term also fits very well with the status of these. They were at one time teachers of EAP, or TEEPs, but they have been raised up into a place that's not quite teacher, not quite manager, not quite anything. They have lots of responsibilities, but they have no power. They live in this very perilous space, third space in between. Now, how do these bleeps survive and thrive? What effect do they have upon TEEPs, that is, the teachers of EAP? Those will be the issues that we will look at in the second part of this seminar.